Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and patch 1105, WoW's 20th anniversary, released a brand new catch-up raid for players to dive back into to celebrate 20 years of World of Warcraft that took the Blackrock Depths dungeon and turned it into a full-blown raid, using a lot of the original bosses as part of the boss roster. And it's an incredible encounter that I got to do recently with my guild on heroic difficulty. Definitely one that is quite challenging to get through, with a lot of the bosses being a little bit more demanding in some cases compared to Nerbar Palace Heroic. So I wanted to go over all of the different fights and give you guys a guide on how to defeat every single one of the bosses within the Blackrock Depths so that you may have an easier time getting through this instance and claiming all of the powerful items and loot, as well as all of the items that are available on the gear vendors available outside of the Caverns of Time. As always, if you guys want to see more guides like these for the War Within expansion, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right back into the Blackrock Depths. So the first thing that's noteworthy about this new raid dungeon for 1105 of the Blackrock Depths is, while it does only have 8 boss encounters, there's also a lot of other mini boss encounters that are spread throughout the entire instance. The original version of Blackrock Depths was the fortress of a dungeon with a ton of different boss fights, and while not all of those boss fights made into real bosses for the raid version during the classic time walking, a lot of them are still mini encounters that have their own set of unique mechanics that should be respected. And it's worth clearing all of them out because they actually grant you even more currencies that drop from the raid, but also more of those coffer keys that can be turned into raid gear from the gear vendors. Also, something that's to note about the Blackrock Depths raid, a lot of the bosses have very predictable mechanics, and they have a very specific priority at which they use all those abilities, and they're very consistent. And they have kind of a strict pattern of when they use those abilities, which makes a lot of these fights very predictable and also a lot easier to pick up as you see more of these fights back to back. So I'll try to cover all of these bosses in the order of the abilities that you'll be seeing so you can deal with them all accordingly. Now, the first boss of this raid is going to be Lord Roccor, which mostly summons a lot of adds for you to AoE down, so you want to spec into AoE builds in order to be able to nuke those adds as quickly as possible. The boss from periodically is going to cast the ability of Rolling Magma, which just creates a big fiery volcanic orb on the ground. You just want to step away from it in order to be able to avoid it. His main mechanic, however, is going to be Eruption, where he'll deal some group-wide AoE damage and summons pools of magma. Each and every single one of those pools of magma is also going to spawn 3 living magmas that will start crawling towards the pool. And as a raid, you want to step and run through as many living magmas as possible in order to deny them from being able to reach the pool. But for every magma that you stomp through, it applies a stack of living magma debuff, which deals fire damage over time. In most cases, you want to have each player stomp on as many living magmas as possible, but if you're trying to limit the damage taken, have each player run over 3 magmas at a time, which will not deal too much damage and will make it much more manageable for healers to deal with. But you really should encourage everybody in your raid to participate in this mechanic specifically. Otherwise, if any living magmas reach the pool, they become a big add, which will change a little bit how you deal with the adds, but for the most part, you get you nuke it down quickly. After a while, the boss casts Crystallization, turning all of those pools of magma into adds, but if any living magmas reach the pools, they become a bigger adds. The smaller adds don't really do much. Sons of Roccor just kind of hit, they just auto attack and you group them up on the boss and nuke him down easily. The bigger ones are going to cast an ability called Slag Armor, which is something that can be interrupted, crowd controlled, but also dispelled. But it is a mechanic that is going to start hitting your tanks and everybody else in your raid really quickly, as they'll keep casting it over and over, applying this debuff that deals volcanic damage, making allies and the tank take additional increased damage. These are the adds that should be highest priority as you try to nuke them down and interrupt them and crowd control them as quickly as you can. After a little bit of time, the boss will cast Volcanic Upheaval, usually after 2 sets of adds, where the boss does group-wide damage for 7 seconds. This is a good opportunity for you to send raid cooldowns in order to deal with the damage taken, but for the most part, it's just an AoE cleave encounter where you want to focus down on the adds as quickly as possible, run through as many living magmas in order to limit the amount of upgraded bigger adds that you can summon, and then cleave down all the adds with the boss as quickly as possible. Now the next boss is Bael'Gar, which is mostly a single target fight with a little bit of cleave and AoE going on. I think if you play for like a cleave build, you'll mostly will be fine. The main mechanic of this boss is going to be Giant Strike, which is something that tanks are going to have to deal with. Basically, this boss's auto attacks do constant cleave frontal damage that does a ton of damage forwards, but this is damage that can be split evenly amongst all targets, and the best target to split the damage is the tank. So two tanks need to stand together to help split the damage from this frontal. It doesn't really matter which one of the two tanks is tanking the boss, they just gotta stand next to one another. Shortly after you start the fight, the boss is going to cast Rockfall, causing the ceiling to crumble, pummeling the area with rubble, which will inflict physical damage every 1 second for 12 seconds to all players, but also additional damage to any of the swirlies underground. So you want to try to avoid the swirlies as best you can, but do a little bit of stutter stepping. As the rockfall happens, the boss is also going to cause boulders to start crumbling down as well. Once these boulders are active, you want to have everybody in the group focus down on boulders all but one. You want to make sure that at least one boulder stays alive for the next boss ability. Shortly after the boulders fall, the boss is going to cast the ability of Molten Furnace, which deals insane amounts of volcanic damage to everybody in the raid, but this is why you want to hide behind a boulder to avoid taking the damage to begin with. And everybody in the raid should do this because this volcanic damage is going to pierce your healers, DPS, as well as the tanks. Afterwards, you want to finish off any of the boulders and any of the active adds. As you destroy the boulders, they create little adds, which aren't that scary, but as the adds die, which should be a priority also, they'll put debuffs on the rest of your raid group, which will deal additional fire damage over time, just something for your healers to manage. And after a little bit of time, after Molten Furnace, the boss is going to cast Shatter, where the boss deals decent raid-wide damage to the entire group. This is why boulders are top priority, because we want to try to limit the amount of damage that Shatter is going to do. But that's basically the entire fight. Technically, you can have the tanks move the boss closer to boulders so you can cleaving down Bael'Gar, but because of this frontal ability he does, if you turn the frontal into the rest of the raid, that can easily wipe out a lot of your group, so we found it easier to have tanks just keep the boss in one standard position to make sure we can avoid his frontal attack. Now, from here on, this is where the bosses get a little bit more difficult, with Lord Incendius being the first one of the three. The boss room for Lord Incendius is split into 3 areas, and at first, a third of the room will be covered in fire, but then the other 2 spots, the other 2/3 of the spots of the room, are safe. Then it switches where 2/3 of the boss room are on fire, but 1/3 of the boss room is safe, and this keeps alternating back and forth between the fight, and you'll have to constantly move towards the safe spots in order to avoid taking fire damage. The fire isn't that bad of damage, but you don't really want to stay in there for too long because the damage can really ramp up. Now, this boss, like all the other ones so far, summons quite a few adds, specifically summons flame geysers to the encounter. These adds cast an ability of Blaze, which deals damage and will get faster and faster every single time they finish off the cast of the ability. These adds are fully CCable. That means it can be interrupted, stunned, feared, frozen. Any kind of crowd control helps you deal with them. But also these adds, when they die, they explode. And a few players need to stick near the adds in order to soak that explosion. Otherwise it deals raid-wide damage. The explosion will also send players flying away from the ad's location, so you want to make sure you try not to fall off the boss platform. Another ability the boss is going to do is a blowback, where the boss boards to one side of the room and sends winds away from him. These winds are going to push the entire raid off the platform, and you want to run against them to make sure you don't get knocked off. The tanks will also need to pass the debuff of blowback between each other using taunt in order to avoid getting knocked off the platform, as they are going to take the biggest blowback from the knockback ability. And that's basically the entirety of the encounter. The longer this fight goes on, however, the more adds will continue to spawn from the boss. At first he spawns a set of 2, then eventually a set of 3, and then it keeps ramping up until your team gets overwhelmed. So you kind of want to focus the boss the most of the encounter, and you want to move the boss next to one of the adds to make sure that you're still able to cleave onto the boss and actually be able to hit him the entire fight. Because the faster the boss dies, the less chance you'll have of being overrun or being knocked off the platform. Soaking adds, however, is a high priority. Once the adds do die, a couple players need to stand next to the add in order to soak the debuff. Even if the add is in fire, it's actually better to go into the fire and the flames and maybe pop a defensive, but it's better that at least somebody soaks the add than if nobody soaks it, because that could lead to an easy raid wipe. Now, the next boss is going to be the Golem Lord Argelmach, and this fight is a very unique one because when you kill the boss, his soul splits and awakens the golems all around the area. The main mechanic you should watch out for the golems is that is consistent throughout the encounters. These golems can't be too close to one another, otherwise they empower each other and each other's abilities, where they become a little bit more deadly. For the most part, the tanks are going to want to get the attention of the fire golem and the Arcane Golem, and it'll try to keep them not too close to each other, but also not too far apart either. You can move the Arcane Golem near a Lightning Golem, at least close enough where they're not too close to empower each other, but close enough where your raid can potentially cleave them down, but not too close. Classes like Affliction Warlock, Shadow Priest, Balance Druids, and other dark classes will have a much easier time with this encounter, since so many of these bosses are so far split apart. Now, each and every one of these golems has a handful of mechanics to watch out for, and we'll start up with the Lightning Golem or Electron MK2. Which deals mostly just lightning damage passively to the entire raid, which has mostly a radial AoE area around it. They also have a spell of Livewire, which used to be dispelled by the healers, and you want to make sure to take Livewire out of the group before you dispel it. You also use an ability called Lethal Attraction, so when you are hit by Lethal Attraction, you need to stand next to another tethered player, standing within 5 yards of one another so as to not die. When it comes to the Poison Golem or Toxitron MK2, he mostly fires chemical bombs throughout the fight, leaving toxic puddles on the ground which can be easily avoided. The Fire Golem's flamethrower ability in fact can actually get rid of these puddles, which does cause some group-wide damage but will be necessary to make the fight a little bit easier. His main ability is going to be Poison Mist, however, which hits the entire raid room with a poison debuff on the entire group. It's a big healer cooldown angle here, so you're gonna have to send some CDs in order to be able to live that part of the encounter. And you also, once you're debuffed by the poison, it's a perma dot that can only be removed by running through the Fire Golem's flamethrower ability to burn off the debuff. All you need to do is step in real quickly and step out to make sure that the debuff is burned off of your character. The Fire Golem is going to be one of those golems that needs to be tanked by one of the tanks, and this will be part of the tank swap mechanics. The Golem has a flamethrower ability, which we just talked about, and what it does is applies melt armor on the tank, which will cause them to take additional damage and will be one of those mechanics that tanks will want to swap out for. You'll also want to use the Fire Golem's flamethrower ability to remove poison puddles from the ground in order to be able to mitigate them as best as possible, because after a while that Fire Golem is going to use the ability of Incineration, which will blow up, dealing big raid-wide damage to the entire group. This Incineration effect also burns up all chemical pools as well, and for every pool that is removed, it also deals additional raid-wide damage. This is why you want to control and remove as many pools as possible with Flamethrower so that Incineration does not wipe your entire group. Finally, we have the Arcane Golem, which only has 2 mechanics. One is going to be Arcane Overcharge, where the boss is going to toss out a bunch of arcane bombs all around his current location. For the most part, you need to soak him or take raid-wide damage. Every time you soak one of those arcane bombs, usually done by the tank, you take additional increased arcane damage. This is where the tank or somebody in the DPS with an immunity could potentially soak him as well in order to make the tank swap and tank mechanic a little bit easier to deal with. The other ability this Arcane Golem is going to do is Power Generator, which causes the boss to start to coalesce arcane energy towards him, which will create these arcane orbs that will slowly start to crawl towards the boss. You can soak these arcane orbs to increase your damage done by 12% per stack of each orb, which is a great bloodlust angle for this encounter. So it's a good idea to hold your bloodlust until the Arcanotron MK2 or the Arcane Golem uses Power Generator, pick up as many orbs, bloodlust, and burn these bosses as quickly as possible. The next encounter is going to be the 7, which are 7 restless spirits that occurs to continue to serve the Dark Iron Ruler for the rest of the eternity. Throughout this encounter, out of the 7, most of the 7 are going to be incorporeal, which means while incorporeal, they inflict 50% reduced damage and suffer 100% reduced damage, which basically makes him immune to all attacks. Though while most are incorporeal, 3 at a time are going to be made corporeal, which allows the raid group to actually deal damage to those targets. The 2 that are constantly corporeal are going to be the 2 tank adds, Angerel as well as Groomrel. Angerel has a Sunder Armor mechanic which can stack up to, I guess, as many times as you want to, but this is going to be primarily the tank swap mechanic of Angerel, where you want to swap out after 3 Sunder Armors. He also does a Mortal Strike, which is going to make it harder to heal the tank that is a tank in Angerel, so you'll need a defensive cooldown for it, and Blazestorm that deals group-wide damage, which you'll want to try to avoid as best as possible. Then there's Gloomrel that used to be handled by the other tank. Gloom puts up a Bleed of Rend on the primary tank, which deals a lot of physical damage. He also does Rampage, which also deals additional physical damage, and Recklessness, which causes all his abilities to deal 100% increased damage. The most of it is physical, and tanks should be able to avoid it for the most part as long as they have a defensive cooldown. Both Groomrel and Angerel do quite a bit of damage on their own. Angerel really having that big Sunder Armor mechanic, that's like the only thing that you can really use to swap around on. And again, try to swap out on 3 Sunder Armors if possible. Both Angerel and and Groomrail are constantly active, and tanks will want to position them next to any of the other 7 that are also marked as corporeal, so that the whole entire raid can cleave all 3 bosses down. The first boss that becomes corporeal is Doomrail, who has a Shadowbolt volley that can be easily interrupted. When he becomes corporeal, he gains 2 more abilities. Banish, which will literally banish an ally for 30 seconds, which needs to be dispelled instantly, but also will summon a Felguard. While it's good to interrupt Shadowbolt Volley, you really want to make sure you save all your interrupts for someone Felguard to deny him the ability to summon additional adds into the encounter. After Doomrail, the next of the 7 that becomes empowered is Doprel, which doesn't really do much. He's kind of like this roguish character that doesn't really do anything until incorporeal. He's the roguish character that just keeps following all of the other bosses, and this one is the easiest to position together to really group them up. Though even the ranged players will want to get closer, because when he does the smoke bomb ability, which is more annoying than anything, it just limits your range of abilities by 100%. So you really want to be close enough to be able to continue to cleave him down with the other tanking bosses. The next of the 7 that becomes corporeal is Hate Rel, that mostly casts Magma Bolt, which can be easily interrupted, but when the boss also becomes corporeal, it also casts a Magma Burn, which needs to be dispelled by the healers, and will summon a Fire Elemental, which needs to be top priority whenever it is active. The Elemental also needs to be interrupted, otherwise it uses Fire Nova, which does a great bit of AoE damage. The next of the 7 to become corporeal will be Seathrel, which mostly casts Blizzard throughout the encounter, which will create just patches of frost that you want to move off to the side of the raid in order to make sure you don't fill out the center of the boss arena, so you can have an easier way maneuvering around to all of these bosses. When this boss becomes corporeal, she still continues to cast blizzards, but towards the end of her corporeal form, she casts Bitter Cold, which reads all players in rhyme, and after 5 seconds deals a ton of frost damage to all players within 8 yards. So you want to spread out apart from each other, and will also root you for 3 seconds. This is where you'll need dispels and any kind of root breaks in order to get out of the AoE effect. And the last of the 7 to become corporeal is Bael'Gar, which is kind of like this priesty type of entity. As a priest, he does cast Powered Respite, which places a shield on one of the allies that needs to be broken. While the shield persists, it does start to heal one of his allies, so you want to break through a shield as quickly as possible when he casts it. He is also the most annoying boss out of the 7 though, because he's the one that places those green circles that keep terrifying anybody within those circles. And when he is made corporeal, he also uses Mind Torrent ability, which is another one of those mechanics where you have to stand on top of the player getting hit by Mind Torrent, and then try to soak it in order to try to split the damage between everybody else. So majority of this fight is juggling all of these boss mechanics at the same time, though it's a big positional encounter for tanks specifically, because if you're trying to take out these bosses as quickly as possible, you want to position the 2 tanking adds, Anger and Gloom, next to any of the other 7 that are also made corporeal, so that you can cleave them down as a raid group. While making sure to step away when you have Blizzard and step back away from the Horrify ability, making sure to interrupt whichever add, or rather whatever boss that is currently corporeal. And it's also a priority for tanks to make sure that you don't reach too many Sunders from Angerforge. The next fight only heats things up a bit more with General Angerforge, which is the most weirdest, but also the most unique encounter of this raid so far, and we just talked about the 7. So, General Angerforge fight is just a big gauntlet fight, where you want to make your way through the gauntlet to take down the harbingers of flame elementals that deal raid-wide damage. This raid-wide damage will continue to increase over time, so your job is to get to these elementals, remove their immunity, and open a path towards General Angerforge himself. Basically, as you get through the fight, you want to run through safety spots behind pillars, duck behind cover in order to avoid fire and bullets whizzing by, and get into safety bubble areas where there will be an officer together with a bunch of other adds standing guard. One of the tanks will want to pick up the officer and pull him away from the rest of the adds, which the other tank wants to pick up and group together. Otherwise, those adds are buffed by Commanding Aura, which empowers the adds with more damage done, less damage taken, and makes him immune to crowd control and interrupts. Your goal in those safety areas is to take out the Flamekeeper and the other adds as soon as possible, and make sure to dodge the Ring of Fire, where you want to walk out away from the ring as a raid and then walk back in to avoid it. After you defeat the adds, defeat the officer, pick up the item from the Flamekeeper, and you'll use it in order to make the next flame elemental vulnerable, which is how you get rid of these fire elementals one at a time. And you should take out 2 fire elementals before you can finally reach General Angerforge. However, after the first elemental, the rest of the gauntlet is still a little bit long afterwards. There will be 2 more safety spots for you to get through as you make your way towards the Flame Keeper. And every single one of those safety spots, you'll want to separate the officer away from the Flame Keeper as well as any of the adds in order to have an easier time dealing with them. After you take out the second Flame Keeper, you'll want to run quite a bit of a distance back to get to the second fire elemental, remove immunity as well as nuke it down. This is where you'll then be able to go to the center of the boss arena, where you can actually fight the boss himself, General Angerforge, where a lot of the similar mechanics are going to come in. He's going to summon adds, which is to be pulled away from the boss if possible and nuked down. But the boss, however, is going to do more things like throw out around dark iron bombs, as well as a fire burst grenade, which needs to be line of sighted behind one of the pillars. The boss also does an ability called Shadow Armor, which is going to inflict on the tank quite a bit of physical damage. It'll give him a debuff where he takes more physical damage until the end of the encounter. So you kind of want to decide which tank is going to tank Angerforge, and you basically hold Angerforge until that tank dies, and then you switch out with the other tank. For the most part, this is just a boss rush at the very end of the encounter, where you're trying to kill General Angerforge as quickly as possible. While he does have Commanding Aura, which is going to buff up all of the other adds, you want to try to separate him from the adds as best as possible, but for the most part, it's no longer a cleave fight. At the end of it though, you are trying to mostly take down Angerforge as quickly as possible, while maneuvering him around to avoid any of the Dark Iron Bombs as well as the Fire Burst grenades. The next boss is going to be Ambassador Flamelash. You thought General Angerforge was an ad fight? Well, get ready for Ambassador, which is going to be an ads galore encounter. There is a lot of AoE in ad fights within this raid instance, isn't there? With Ambassador Flamelash, he has a couple of different ads he summons, like Fire Starters, which are ads that will fixate on a specific player, usually somebody in the ranged or a healer variety, and will rush towards that player. Any player that comes within 5 yards of the ad will cause it to explode where it stands, so you kind of want to let the fixator players run those ads out a little bit, so melee will want to take a step back away from the ads to make sure they don't prematurely explode. The boss is also going to summon a Flame Walker, which is going to be kind of like a mini version of Ambassador Flamelash, which needs to be picked up by the tank. The ad, very similar to the boss, will have a tank frontal, which needs to be faced away from the group. The ad also uses an ability called Superheat, which will deal AoE explosion, but it is reduced the further you are away from the ad. This ad will use the ability of Superheat very shortly after it spawns, so you'll want to be sure to position the ad not too close to the boss, but also not too far away to make sure you can still kind of sort of cleave it, but also can avoid the ability of Superheat. When the ad dies, it also casts a big explosive demise, which will deal a decent bit of raid-wide damage for you healers to take care of. As for the boss itself, Ambassador Flamelash does a handful of things, such as a frontal cleave that the tank will need to face away from the rest of the group, as well as an ability of Cremate, which is an ability that deals millions of fire damage to the tank, as well as all players within 10 yards, but this damage is split amongst all enemies struck, so you will want to make sure that the raid is stacked on the tank in order to be able to split the damage of Cremate. Cremate will also be part of the tank swap mechanic because it'll put a debuff on the tank called Flamelash, so this is where you want to make sure the tanks taunt off on the boss. After a bit of time, the boss is going to open portals to the Firelands, where 6 portals will spawn into the room. The DPS players at that point will need to nuke down the ads as well as take down the obelisks in order to shut down the portals, and for us, we found this is the best time to use Bloodlust in order to be able to take down those ads and the portals as quickly as possible. You want to nuke down these portals as quickly as you can and make sure the ads don't get their cast off, because for every single cast that they do, the boss is going to gain a buff, which is going to cause them to erupt with AoE raid-wide fire damage for each stacks of the buffs that it gets. So use AoE stops like stuns, fears, or anything you got in order to prevent as many casts as possible and focus the ads over the portals. And basically, for this encounter, you found that it's a lot easier to focus down the boss for majority of this encounter. So your build is going to be primarily the one that is single target, though maybe with some form of AoE cooldowns. You want to try to keep the boss towards the center of the raid in order to have an easier time picking up the ads, but also the easiest time when it comes to your raid having to split among to shut down the portals so your healers can reach everybody accordingly. Where we find ourselves struggling a little is during the second set of Firelands portals, which is where we're usually out of cooldowns, and we can't deal with those portals as quickly as we could for the first ones, which causes us to start to get overwhelmed very quickly. The boss starts getting stacks, deals additional AoE damage, and we usually lose a couple players before we get another Cremate soak. But if you have the boss at around 30% health by the time he does the second set of portals, For the most part, you should be able to just to burn down the boss. You'll have to have your healers ready with some cooldowns in order to deal with some additional raid-wide damage that's going to come out because of the ads and the Firelands portals. But if the boss is about 30% health, he doesn't have that much health compared to the rest of the encounters, so you should be able to burn down fairly quickly. And finally, we have Emperor Dagran Thaurissan, which is an excellent encounter that has a lot of different mechanics for you to account for. It is a very, very fun fight that actually only gets easier as you get out of phase 1 and further into phase 3. While this does seem like a fight with multiple boss targets, which makes you think this is a cleave-based fight, it's actually a lot easier to do this fight when you go for a pure single-target build, since you're going to be focusing down on one boss at a time. During phase 1, you'll want to place Moria towards the center of the room, while you want to keep Dagran near the throne. Moria, specifically in phase 1, is what makes this encounter very, very difficult, and your goal in the phase 1 is to take out Moria as soon as possible. This is a great bloodless opportunity to go for pure single target damage to try to take out Moria as quickly as you can. We even changed our raid comp a little bit by having one of our healers go full on DPS to take down Moria as quickly as possible, because phase 2 and phase 3 of this fight are much easier after Moria is gone. Moria places a lot of various dots that are super difficult to get rid of, from Shadow Word Nemesis, which is basically a perma dot that cannot ever be removed, and this dot also ramps up over time, dealing more and more damage the more stacks it gains. Dispelling the dot does not cause it to get removed, but instead causes it to jump to 2 other players, which basically means you want to limit your dispels and only dispel once anybody with Shadow Word Nemesis reaches 5 stacks of the debuff, so you don't want to be dispelling as quickly as possible. The other debuff she pulls down is Shadow Word Necrosis, which is a big healing debuff where whoever has the debuff takes a lot less healing. You basically want to take this debuff away from any of the tanks or targets that have Shadow Word Nemesis on them. Usually you would have a ranged DPS pick it up away from the rest of the raid and keep it away from them as best as possible. Any player that has this debuff removed from them, so when you give it to another player, you are then left with Lingering Necrosis. Getting the debuff again while you have Lingering Necrosis, it leads to instant death. So you want to have a healthy rage player take this debuff away from anybody of your group, and ideally hold it for as long as possible while taking down Moria Bronzebeard. Moria also does a handful of other things, like try to heal Dagran with Radiant Infusion, which will have her channeling towards the boss. But if you have a player between her and the channel, you instead soak this Radiant Infusion, which will actually burn you instead of healing you. For the most part, we had players rotate to soak a few stacks of this debuff, usually between 2 and 3 stacks, which will deal very little damage to a single player. In most cases, you'll have a tank take a few more stacks than normal. But even if she does get a little bit of healing between her and Dagran, it's not the end of the world, because this debuff does do a lot of damage, so it's best to take a few stacks, and if some healing goes through, same healing goes through. It's not as big of a heal for her, it is a much more bigger heal for Dagran, but we're focusing on Moria, not Dagran, at the beginning of the encounter. Another thing Moria is going to do is Mind Blast, which can be easily interrupted. It does a decent bit of shadow damage to the tank that's going to be currently tanking her, so you definitely want to make sure that you have an interrupt available for that ability. Another mechanic she does is going to be very difficult, and why she got to get taken out as quickly as possible, is Mind Shattering Screams, which we'll call this mechanic Pizza Slices. Mind Shattering Scream covers the entire room in shadow and void, but leaves a few pizza slices safe, and you basically want to jump in pizza slices to keep yourself safe, while making sure not to pass around the Shadow Word Necrosis to each and every one of the group members. But focusing down Moria as hard as you can during phase 1 of the encounter, you get to remove all of these mechanics as soon as she is down. So Nemesis and Necrosis all go away, and you no longer have to deal with Mind Blast, Mind Shattering Screams, or the pizza slice mechanics, as well as the Radiant Infusion. So taking her out at the very beginning of the fight is your top priority. However, while Moria does seem like the more tougher boss to take down, it doesn't mean that Dagran doesn't have mechanics for us to deal with either. Dagran will have the main tank with Ironforge, where every 3rd strike will also hit 3 additional times, which deals a lot of damage, but not necessarily something you have to tank swap for just yet. Dagran also uses Hand of Thaurissan, which creates 3 lines of flaming hammers that will hurl at 3 raid members, usually targeting healers and ranged DPS. Generally, you'll want to move these hammer lines away from the rest of the raid, but remember that the hammer lines will also knock the player getting hit by the lines, so you want to make sure you don't get yourself knocked into lava. Dagran also does an ability called Magma Clap, which just means watch your feet and have some group-wide healing going for whenever he casts the ability. His main mechanics, however, is going to be to call an Imperial Guard as well as a Twilight's Hammer. When it calls the Imperial Guard, a guard will respond to assist him in combat, and the guard will mostly just have a frontal conal bleed attack that could be easily avoided and baited by the tank. Usually, the tank that's currently on Princess Moria is the one that will pick up all Imperial Guards, leaving the tank with Emperor Thaurissan kind of soloing him all on his own. However, when Emperor Dagran Thaurissan calls in the Twilight Hammer, he'll summon 4 caster ads on the balcony of the boss arena. The DPS need to immediately swap to those ads as soon as possible and interrupt their Pyroblast ability as much as they can to limit the damage that they do. He wants to slay all of these ads before they cast Moment of Twilight, which deals massive raid-wide damage, so this ads are going to be your highest priority. Phase 2, or I guess quote-unquote Phase 2, begins once Moria is dead. There isn't a real Phase 2 of this encounter, but I would call it Phase 2 because after Moria goes down, Emperor Dagran Thaurissan gets empowered. The fight becomes a lot easier from that point on, however, because all of Moria's mechanics are essentially removed from the encounter, and you still have a handful of mechanics of Emperor Dagran Thaurissan still in play, as well as the ads, but it's a lot easier to deal with from this point on. Though once Dagran becomes the Avatar of Flame in Phase 2, or we'll call it Phase 2, he does gain a handful of abilities, like Iron Brand, which basically is the tank mechanic of Iron Foe, but it becomes a little bit stronger because it now leaves behind an Iron Brand on the tank that he smacks, which inflicts fire damage for 30 seconds and will be part of your main tank swap mechanics. The other ability he'll get is Molten Hand, where those hammer lines will now cause the player hit by those lines to shoot out 4 spheres of magma in 4 directions. So you want to try to run those lines as far away from the raid as you can in order to have an easier time avoiding those lava spheres. Then Magma Clap will be transformed into a Magma Shock, which will deal the same damage but will now apply a Magma Shock debuff on the entire raid, which is a dispellable debuff but will give summon for your healers to heal. Then he'll gain an ability of Magma Shower, which will just create more fire swirlies for you to avoid. Just watch your feet and try to stay out of those as best as possible. Both the guard summons as well as the Twilight Hammer ads are still a priority, however, until the boss hits about 70% health. Once the boss reaches 70% health, this is where he hits his Phase 3, where he invokes the Avatar of Ragnaros to add 3 additional mechanics into the encounter. So you'll basically be dealing with Phase 2 version of Dagran minus any of the ads, but instead it will be replaced with the Avatar of Ragnaros to add 3 new abilities into the mix. One of which is Volcanic Blast, where Ragnaros will hurl a massive boulder of magma at a player, dealing a ton of damage that pierces all immunity, so you can't cloak it or bubble it. I had to learn that one the hard way. You basically, as a raid, want to soak this mechanic in order to reduce the damage, and once it hits, move immediately because it'll leave a puddle of volcanic stone. Another ability the Avatar does is Volcanic Volley, which is a healer mechanic. Just have some kind of a healer cooldown ready in order to be able to deal with additional outgoing damage. The Avatar of Ragnaros will also summon a Fire Guard Destroyer, which is an ad that you'll want to focus down as a raid and interrupt the ad's ability of Fire Nova. When this ad dies, it uses Fiery Demise, showering the ground with flames, where you'll want to have a handful of players soak those flames to reduce group-wide damage taken. Those showered flames will also summon Firelings ads, which don't really do much, but really need to be AoE down as quickly as possible. And like I mentioned before, all of Dagran's Phase 2 mechanics are still present in this phase, which means the lines, the AoE damage, as well as the tank swap mechanics, so those still need to be handled while playing around the Avatar of Ragnaros, which isn't all that bad altogether, but there are some interesting overlaps, however, specifically with the Summon Fire Guard Destroyer, which can be delayed, like if you choose to kill him a little bit later. Don't focus him down and just interrupt him while focusing Dagran for the most part. You can delay the death of Fireguard Destroyer so he doesn't have as bad of an overlap with some of the other raid-wide mechanics. Phase 3 of the fight has to be the easiest part of this encounter, as it's all about room management and good mechanical play. And if you are, for some reason, losing out on players towards the tail end of the fight, you can actually start sacrificing raid members to the lava soaks. Like if you're running out of healing options, it's actually better for you to start losing out one player at a time to that soak instead of having to potentially lose the entire raid if you don't have the healing cooldowns in order to be able to mitigate the soak. However, when you do get targeted by the Volcanic Blast ability, we also notice that certain classes do have a way to bypass that mechanic completely. Like rogues, when they use Vanish, can apparently cancel out a mechanic entirely. Since you can vanish it, I assume other classes like Hunters with Feign Death or Mages with Great Invisibility could probably bypass it as well, or maybe potentially even Night Elves with a Shadow Meld ability. So it is something to watch out for, depending on the class that gets hit by it. Can technically make it a little bit easier, but even the damage that it does is not nearly as bad as the phase 1 version of the encounter. But with that, that's going to be my guide on how to defeat every single boss encounter within the Blackrock depth raid on both heroic and normal difficulty. Definitely an incredible encounter that is worth experiencing. The one that I noticed was a little bit harder than a lot of us expected, as a lot of us thought Blackrock Depths raid was going to be a catch-up raid that was going to be very pug friendly, but with the difficulty of the uptake of some of these boss encounters towards the tail end in particular, there's quite a lot of coordination required in order to have an easier time with all of these fights. And I wonder if we'll see even more nerfs hitting this raid instance over the next few weeks, because they've already nerfed a lot of these encounters, especially for normal, to make it a little bit easier to bug through. And I wonder if we'll see more of these nerfs arrive to the heroic version of these bosses as well. But with that, I do want to thank you guys all so much for watching this guide video, and I hope all of you did enjoy it. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very much appreciate it. Join our Discord community. If you got any more questions regarding this raid, maybe I can give you some more pointers as to what me and my guild did in order to bypass every single one of these encounters. Or if you got any more questions, probably the best place to reach me. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. And as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.